When Connor pulled up to the gas station, he got out of the car at a speed that surprised even himself. He took a few quick steps, almost jogging, and then turned back to the car. Under the bright sodium lights of the gas station, the little blue sedan looked a sickly greenish-gray. It looked squat and malevolent in its stillness. With each step, the throbbing headache at the base of his skull seemed to lessen, and he began to catch his breath. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and raised it high into the night sky, waving it from side to side like a signal flag. Nothing. The signal meter challenged him, going blank. Not even a flashing roaming message. Connor glanced glumly at the small phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked around the station. 2 lonely pumps and a closed 24-hour market. A separate island of pale yellow light in the darkness of the North Carolina forest. The silhouettes of trees jutted sharply into the starry night sky, surrounding him like a ring of teeth. The hum of electricity mingled with the crackling of insects from the woods outside the window, spreading in the warm air of the summer night. To the side of the closed market stood a scratched payphone, its metal leg visibly bent from a long-ago blow. Connor walked over to it, pulled a quarter out of his pocket, and picked up the shabby plastic handset. For a moment, nothing happened, and the feeling of isolation intensified, as if the ground had gone out from under his feet and the panic had returned. There was a series of quick clicks in my ear, and the phone rang. His fingers went numb as he dialed the number. Even at a few hours past midnight, Reynolds answered on the first ring. Yes, Reynolds' raspy baritone was silky, unmarred by the late hour. Who is it? I, Connor. He couldn't contain the tremor in his voice, and he had the sudden urge to look back at the car, afraid it might have moved or left him there altogether. That's not the phone I gave you. Reynolds' liquid voice darkened, almost imperceptibly. It's a payphone. There's no signal here. Middle of the goddamn void. Listen, Ren, Is something wrong, Connor? Connor flinched at the soft, calculated condescension in the older man's tone and inhaled slowly, picking his next words with care. Well, shit. I honestly don't know, Ren, but I have a really bad feeling about this. Where are you? At the service station. Just got on the freeway. About to head south through Matahala. And what's the matter, Connor? Like I said, there's something wrong with this car. I didn't like the guy I borrowed the car from. Don't like what's in the fucking trunk. I know it sounds fucking stupid, but it's giving me a headache. I think I can smell it, but I know I can't. There's something rotten about it. I mean rotten. There was a long silence on the other end, and Connor realized that Reynolds had not calmed down. Even as he said the words, Connor realized how stupid they sounded. Connor, the old man finally said, we've worked together for a long time. I've liked you, but you've never cared about what you deliver. What was the strangest thing I asked you to carry? A heart. Connor answers without hesitation, seeing the white foam ice cooler strapped into the front seat like a child's car seat. Yes, you also delivered several pounds of heroin once. Did you know about it at the time? Not until later. Because it's for the best, isn't it, Connor? Reynolds paused, the smooth rhythms of his voice already calming the young man. It's better if you don't know. The man you took the car from is reliable and trustworthy in his own way, just as you are. I can understand why you might dislike him, given his unfortunate appearance, but he's just like you. A reliable contractor, and a discreet one at that. I hire you both for your discretion. Do you understand, Connor? Yes. Okay. I got it. Connor, I believe you won't do it, and forgive me if it's offensive, but don't open the trunk, okay? It won't help. The bag is locked anyway, and it has to stay locked because the customer wants it locked. Sure, Ren. Look, I'm terribly sorry for calling. I guess I was just really scared. Not at all. That's what I'm here for. Now hit the road, Connor, and call me when it's ready. Reynolds hung up before Connor could answer and returned the phone receiver to its stand. Taking the keys in his hands, Connor walked back to the car and moved forward, though his newfound confidence waned as he approached. The ghostly odor, more like a memory of a smell than an actual odor, returned, something sweet and corrupted. As he turned the key to start the engine, the pain in the back of his neck returned, slowly building up. He gritted his teeth and drove out of the service station. The Natahala National Forest closed around the two-lane road, and darkness engulfed the service station behind him. Connor tried to focus on the target, on the route he'd laid out, on the starry sky outside the window, on anything but the trunk. For a few minutes it worked. Connor's blood was flowing with caffeine and a tiny dose of some kind of high-grade speed, just enough to keep him awake. But still, after half an hour of driving on the dark road, his eyes began to water. At first, they were just dry, and he covered his eyes to moisten them. But they began to stay closed longer. They seemed to freeze at the zenith of each blink. The tires slammed into the yellow reflectors of the center line, and as he felt the nauseating rush of adrenaline, he realized he'd skidded. Ahead, headlights illuminated 100 yards of road and reflectors another 100. Glowing dots ran in front of him like tracer bullets, overtaking the lighted road and marking his path in the darkness. They curved upward, signaling a rise in the road before it could be seen. Connor focused on the reflectors, letting them float past him like a soft drop of water. He watched the ghostly line of glowing dots dip and rise with the road, and then, with numb disbelief, saw it soar upward, above his line of sight, swirling into the sky. Connor thought incredulously of the sharp rise, wondering if the car could take such a steep climb. Then the line wriggled like a snake, streaking across the night sky, and Connor, with all the force of which his terror was capable, slammed his foot on the brake. The car skidded to the right, and he righted himself by pulling into the road and braking sharply. There was a dull thud from the trunk, and Connor's heart pounded. The road ahead was perfectly flat, and the yellow reflective lights were anchored in reality. When the car stopped moving, Connor inwardly groaned, demanding to get away, to hide in the relative safety of the dark forest. His hands gripped the steering wheel, bloodless in their strength. Another soft thud came from the trunk, and Connor's heart seemed to stop. Before he knew it, Connor was out of the car, keys jingling in his hand. Fear turned to manic curiosity. If he could just see the thing in the trunk, he could move on. He could drive. He could make one more line and stay awake long enough to throw the damn thing away and just go to sleep. The trunk opened with lubricated efficiency. He smelled it first. It was the old ghostly odor, but now it seemed hauntingly real, clinging to his nostrils. Rotten meat, a dead dog on a hot summer road, belly bursting and muddy eyes of rot. He choked, gasping at the strong odor. When he blinked the tears from his eyes, he saw what was inside, but couldn't understand at first. Shiny emergency blankets, silver on one side and gold on the other, reflecting the meager light of the trunk, were wrapped loosely around a large man-sized bundle. Connor's hands peeled away the metal sheets before he could think. The desire to know was almost painful, though reason screamed for what he already knew. He was carrying a fucking corpse. Beneath the first shiny layer was a woolen army blanket, soaked in a black and oily liquid. The odor grew even stronger. Connor briefly considered whether to stop there, but reached out and pulled back the blackened sheet, feeling the wet liquid cling to his slender fingers. The corpse was naked to the waist and horribly mutilated. One arm ended in a stump. The gray and sunken chest was mottled with bruises and pierced with buckshot. The head was split open, a palm-sized piece of skull lying nearby, covered with clumps of thinning gray hair. Black and rotten teeth grinned in a frozen rictus of pain. One dim dark eye stared back at him. Around his neck was a black leather collar, tight against his gray skin. Metal wires of fine filigree work curved across the leather, forming the semblance of a circuit board. At the clasp was a small metal box where the wires converged and connected, surrounding a small green LED that winked rhythmically. Connor stared for a while. unable to believe his eyes. The silent forest surrounded him, and his gaze was fixed on the corpse, a dead hobo with an electric collar in his trunk. He wanted to be angry, knew he should be terrified, but it was pointless, and he couldn't work out a single emotion despite hundreds tearing out. A sharp headache snapped him out of his trance, and he stared into the forest. After wrapping the body and wiping his hands, he closed the trunk. He returned to the driver's seat and stared ahead at the smooth road, his breathing strangely calm. He was tired again, and the nameless dancing fear remained far in the periphery. It was simple now. He had to deliver the car. That was all there was to it. He was rushing, against his own rules and instincts, down the forest roads at reckless speed, music playing loudly to wake him up. But it didn't help. The drowsy fog seemed to pull him harder and harder, and the ticking of the tall trees and the rhythm of the white reflective paint on the road beat out a tattoo of hypnotic regularity. It was some time before he realized that the radio was no longer on. All that remained was the steady lulling noise of the engine, the hiss of tires bouncing off the pavement, and the thumping from the trunk. A steady rhythm of thumps, sharp blows, fists on metal. Connor squeezed his eyes tightly shut and clenched his teeth. The headache took on a new hue, suddenly aggravated, and a chill ran through his body. He pressed down on the gas pedal, trying to accelerate to get rid of the trunk and its cargo, but felt it accelerate with him, pursuing him with equal intensity. When he opened his eyes, his heart jumped to his throat. The forest was gone. He was driving on a 4-lane highway, but the terrain was foreign to him. He resisted the urge to come to an abrupt stop again, tried to suppress the pounding in his chest, but a panicked animal despair welled up in him. Everything was wrong. Despite the huge road, he was the only driver in both directions. There were no road signs. There were no mile markers. He'd lost time on long trips before, but he always stayed on course, coming out of his trance exactly where he wanted to be, and he'd never gotten lost. Connor knew all the roads and trails for 100 miles in any direction, but he couldn't tell where he was. The clock on the dashboard indicated that he had lost minutes. He was a dozen miles from any road of that size. This isn't fair, he thought, and repeated it out loud. His voice was thin and pinched, a childish protest. It can't be. Below him and behind him spread a vast field of black soil, reflective plastic and paint. The trunk had fallen silent, but still loomed ominously behind him. He grabbed the cell phone lying nearby and opened it. Nothing. Connor had only one course of action. Take the first exit, find another service station, reroute, get the damn car. A small thread of hope, woven with as solid a plan as he could think of, tugged at him, and he pushed the little blue sedan even harder. Together, driver and passenger rushed down the road. He felt a rush of elation as the orange sign ahead broke the monotony of the ghostly highway. As he approached, a tall black sign reading "Road Work Ahead" popped out of the gloom. It wasn't what he'd hoped for, but at least it was a change, at least something to break the impossible emptiness of the unknown road. Ahead, the left lane was blocked by a slanted line of bright orange traffic cones, pushing Connor back one lane. The line continued, disappearing into the darkness. Connor strained, trying to make out the lights and hear the noise of construction equipment. The late-night work had spread a fresh layer of tar. Nothing. The line of cones veered off again, blocking the next lane. Connor braced himself behind it, feeling his hopes fade into darkness. The line shifted again, forcing him into the far right lane. Finally, as he realized before he even saw it, the plastic cones blocked the last lane, and then the curb with one bright orange line, dividing and blocking further traffic. Connor slowed his step, his instincts forcing him to obey all traffic laws screaming as he tried to comprehend this logical contradiction. It didn't take him long to make up his mind. He knew he didn't want to stay here, alone and motionless, with that thing in the back of his truck. The one that might not be dead. If he was driving, he was at least getting closer to ending it all. He started the engine, accelerated the car, and sped through the line of cones. They folded under his wheels, tossed into the air, and, illuminated by the red glow of his brake lights, bounced off the road into the night. Everything about Connor's career was geared toward not attracting attention. He hadn't been pulled over since he was caught joyriding at age 13 with a phone book under his seat and a can tied to his leg to reach the pedals. He'd made a career of avoiding attention, but now he wanted to see the flashing blue and red lights behind him. He didn't know how he would explain entering a roadwork zone, speeding, or the disgusting scraps of flesh in his trunk. He didn't really care. He would have given anything to see the other man. If only he could reach Reynolds, hear his soothing voice. Ahead, the 4 dotted lines of reflective paint disappeared. The 4 lanes evaporated, turning into a featureless plain of smooth black tar. Connor felt devastated, overwhelmed. Hot tears came to his eyes. With no lines of road, he suddenly felt himself drifting, veering off course. Impulsively, he turned sharply to the right. A flat field of black road stretched away from his headlights. To hell with this. The sound of his own voice shook him, making him jump slightly, and he released the pedal. The car came to a stop. He opened the door and stepped out onto the black plain. A brittle pain flared in his head, but he knew that if he stepped away from the car, he could think straight. He picked a direction and started walking. The night sky was starless, the horizon cloudless. He looked back once and saw a pool of bright light where the car still stood. His head throbbed, and he quickened his step, changing to a jog. The night air was clean and pleasant, and though his head still throbbed, he felt rested from the freedom of being on his feet. After running a few miles blindly across the asphalt field, he began to worry about whether Reynolds would ever hire him again. Such a relatively mundane worry, absurd in his current situation, caught him like an anchor. He realized he was hallucinating. Although he couldn't say exactly where his senses had become unreliable, he knew it was the only possible answer. And sooner or later, he would stop. And he'd probably never work as a courier again, probably ruin Reynolds' business with his odd rich client who paid to deliver the corpses of transit passengers over back roads. But so what? With a dry chuckle, he realized that Reynolds would be better off without such a client, even if the old man didn't think so at first, because who knew what the client would ask of him next time? And hell, he'd get a job again, even if he had to move and find a new yard to get settled in, because he was the best damn driver in the world. Up ahead, he saw a light, a tiny aberration in the darkness, and started to run, a smile spreading across his face. As he got closer, the skin on his neck tangled, and the icy headache grew deeper. He knew what he was looking at, but he still couldn't face it. It was the sound that made it real. First, he heard the engine, then other sounds. The rattle of a cell phone on the front seat, the squeak of an open door alarm, and finally the steady tapping from the trunk. He didn't want to look at it, wanted to turn away and flee into the darkness forever, not face the car and its ominous cargo just a few feet in front of him when it should be miles away. He snatched one random thought from the chaotic and desperate swirl of his mind. The phone. It was still ringing. He braced himself against the car, feeling its presence like a thick fog, blacker than the surrounding darkness. The car seemed to give in to his onslaught, allowing him to turn off the engine and pick up the phone. He opened the receiver and held it to his ear, trying to ignore the noise from the trunk. "Hello," he whispered into the receiver. "Connor." It was Reynolds' voice, but something was off. The sharp, precise diction, the even tone, some indefinable quality was gone. "Connor, listen to me." "Oh my God. Ren, I think I'm in big trouble." "Did you open the package?" "No, sir, but I don't think it matters." "You should check it out. As long as it's locked, nothing else matters." "I don't think I can look in there. I think he's still alive." "Connor, you have to." Connor felt the heat rising in him again, a paralyzing anger at the absolute injustice of it all. and he growled silently at the sky, then staggered to the back of the car. He slid the key into the lock, fingers shaking uncontrollably, and unlocked the trunk. The smell reached him, but it had changed. The rot gave way to a kind of predatory musk that made Connor's hair stand on end. The silver blankets had been torn to shreds and tossed aside. What was inside was almost unrecognizable. The shattered arm was now a thin and reedy limb, pink and newborn, with too many elbow joints. The wound from the buckshot was almost invisible, and Connor watched in horror as a small ball of lead flew out of one of the few remaining holes and then closed around it. Both eyes stared at Connor, one of them shrunken and glittering, but filled with a malevolent light. It smirked, showing not the black and rotten teeth he remembered, but a shark's grin. Connor found himself on his back, and not remembering how he had fallen, began to weakly crawl away from the car. The headache was suddenly gone, and a confusing flood of stimuli bombarded the springboard of his senses. He was still in the woods. The car stood on the side of the road. In a sudden, painless clarity, the disparate details of the last few hours fell into place. He remembered opening the trunk and seeing the body for the first time. He remembered taking the collar off the corpse and leaving it in the woods. He remembered wondering why he'd done it, even as his fingers closed around it. He remembered forgetting. He remembered why he was in the woods. He still couldn't find his footing, could only crawl away from the open trunk, which was now heaving upward, lit by the faint light of the single bulb on the trunk. One of his two long limbs with impossible joints slipped outward like a spider from a sewer. The phone was still in his hand, and he saw without much surprise that it was still fruitlessly searching for a connection. He tossed it aside and rose to his feet. It had already come out, crouched and waiting. Its dark eyes glimmered in the moonlight. Connor slowly rose to his unsteady feet. The creature reflected him, stretched out to its full, horrifying height, the bloody scraps of its pants clinging to its pale and now spotless frame. Freed from its hideous cargo, the little machine now looked like shelter, like hope, like freedom. But the thing stood between him and any chance of escape. It leaned toward him, shark teeth glistening with saliva. Connor started to laugh, a hopeless and wailing sound. But the moment the creature reached for him, its spidery paws wrapped around his arms, his limbs stiff with fear. The touch was cold, and the knobby fingers felt as if they were clutching vices. The creature laughed with him,